session. I'm going to be talking about some work that I've been doing, and I want to acknowledge Andrea. Andrea's been part of the project, so she's a doctoral student working with me. Thank you very much for coming too, Andrea. But before I start talking about the project, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I put my wallpaper up for you to see. This is where I grew up. I grew up on a farm in central Alberta, and this is the backyard. It doesn't have any cows anymore because my parents are 80 and so and they have retired from farming, but there used to be a lot of cows. There used to be another fence, right? But where we are right now, that's one of the barns at the back, and one of the shelters for the cows as well. So that's where I'm from central Alberta, rural Alberta, and as much as possible, I have been trying to do my research in rural Alberta while being situated in the biggest urban center in the country. So you can imagine that I have really two worlds. My research world is more of what I'm familiar with, actually, because I come into the rural communities. So I'm just going to start the slideshow and tell you that the article that you read for today on the multimodal assessment is kind of like a pilot study for what I'm going to talk about today. So it's all started. Oh, but you know what? I'm going to start before anything else. Where the land has been, who has been walking on the land for thousands of years. There have been First Nations walking on the land where we are sharing knowledge right now, and also where the knowledge has been shared in my research project. And I want to acknowledge the history, the culture, the language, the spirituality of all the First Nations who have been part of the project, and all who have been part of where we are living now in Toronto, and hope that we can remember our responsibilities as signatories of the treaties. So now I will tell you about the partnership project, which takes place in two Canadian provinces, in Alberta, where I'm from, and also in Ontario. All of the communities are rural, and so the population runs from about 200 people to about 500 people, and about 400 people to about 7,000 people. So 7,000 where I'm from is considered almost a city. Where I'm from, if you have 10,000 people, that's considered a city. So some of the towns are getting a little big for this research study. The distance from urban centers, and so this is not Toronto I'm talking about. From Toronto, they're all thousands of kilometers, but from just major urban centers where you could find the typical malls and so on that people in urban centers associate with being urban centers, they're from 200 to 500 kilometers. And then two of the communities that are involved in the study that I'm going to talk about are fly-in communities. So there are no roads except in the wintertime when the lakes freeze over or when the rivers freeze over. And then you can drive along these paths that are carved out with sort of bulldozers. But you have to drive very slowly. So you can imagine if you're driving on ice and snow, you can go maybe up to 50 kilometers, 50, 60 kilometers an hour, but you really can't go any faster than that. So it takes a long time to get from some of the places that are part of the project, the fly-in communities, to an urban center where they can do some shopping. So generally, all the goods are flown in, the people are flown in back and forth whenever they need medical treatment as well. So those are the communities that are involved in the project, very different from probably the communities that you're used to. The teachers and the children who are in the elementary schools are part of the project. Mostly kindergarten teachers and children, but also grade 1. A few grade 1 teachers are involved. And the overall goal of the Northern Oral Language and Writing Through Play project, the Now Play project, is to support young children's literacy and their writing. And because we are involving Indigenous classrooms as well, we are trying as much as possible to support children's Indigenous cultural knowledge and their Indigenous language. The issues, you probably have read about them, are mostly that a lot of the Indigenous community members themselves, the adults, because of the history of residential schools, do not themselves have really strong language, or they're not confident with their language. And so generally the teachers are speaking English in the kindergarten and grade 1 classrooms that are part of the project. So the purpose of this branch of the study's been going on for 7 years now, and so you can imagine that we've been able to branch off in many, many different directions. Writing is one of the aspects of the project, and we wanted to look at assessment because we really believe that if you know a lot about what children are able to do with writing, then you're going to be better at planning instruction for the children. So assessment has been a big part of the Now Play project, with the goal of using the assessment information to plan instruction for the children. So in this case, teachers who are involved in the study asked the researchers, and there are 2 postdoctoral fellows who have been involved in the project, and doctoral students such as Andrea have been involved in the project over the course of the 7 years. And so when I say researchers, I'm talking about all of us. The teachers who have been working with us said that they know that there are assessments out there for young children's writing. There's Mari Clay's assessment from the book, What Did I Write? There are assessments of children's spelling knowledge, especially. Richard Gentry has something that a lot of teachers use. Now, is this familiar to all of you? Or maybe I should just ask, how many are elementary teachers here? Or have been elementary teachers? So you're familiar with some of these, I would think. But maybe nobody else is familiar with the name Richard Gentry. Spelling, no? Okay, well, so maybe I'll tell you a little bit about the spelling, where the researchers have examined many, many samples of children's writing and drawing and scribbling that is used to communicate meaning with others, and they've looked at patterns in the ways that children use the letters, use scribbles and so on, and they've come up with different stages to describe what children can do as sort of a continuum of development, of spelling development. So those are all available to the teachers. But the teacher said, what we would like to have is some kind of an assessment where we can gather writing samples from our children based on something that's part of their lives. You know, if you use the EQAO assessments, for example, the prompts are determined by somebody far, far away, you know, thousands of kilometers away in Toronto, and the children are not able to communicate about who they are and what's important to them. So the teacher said, we want some kind of assessment where the children are creating some kind of a writing sample that's meaningful to them, that speaks to who they are. And then we want to have a set of criteria that we can use so that we can compare children's progress over time. And look at, and what we do as researchers is we look at the writing of a large group of children and we look at the patterns. So what are children of a certain age group doing at the beginning of the year in the fall, and what is that same group of children doing at the end of the year in the spring? So that's the overall purpose of this branch of the project. Our theoretical framework, we're coming from a sociocultural perspective. We do not want to look only at the cognitive aspects of the writing. We do not want to look just at the linguistic aspects. We want to look also at how the children are communicating meaning, generally about their own lives, because that's what the task that we gave them is all about. We're also using the emergent writing, which is more cognitively oriented. The emergent writing folks from, you'll see, the 80s mostly. So the research on young children's writing has been around for a long time. We have known quite a bit about what children can do with print since the 80s. So it's really, really helpful research. So those are the 2 theoretical frameworks that we've been using. One more sociological, one more cognitively oriented. And then the research that is out there, I can just tell you some of these people are more cognitively oriented. Henderson and Templeton and Kiernick and Lonigan are more, and Tolchinsky often, more cognitively oriented. But Rowe and Wilson are moving into the sociological realm as well. So if you would like to read any of these people's research, it'll sort of give you a direction of, if you want to go more cognitive, in the cognitive direction, these are the people that you might want to look at to see what kind of patterns that they have found in children's writing when they have looked at many, many samples of young children's scribbles and other kinds of, and use of letters and words. And then there is a smaller group, but there are people who are looking at children's pictures, at the drawings that young children do, and they're looking at patterns in what children do with their drawings. And so here are some of the people that you might want to take a look at as well. The people that I would highly recommend are Lancaster, She has done some really amazing work. Angela Dyson has done some interesting work. Now, you'll notice it's 1982, so she has moved way into the socio-cultural realm. But in the early 80s, when she first did her work with young children's writing, she was also looking at more of the thinking that was going on, the representation that was going on. So for our study, and you'll probably, having read that article of our pilot study, this will probably sound a little familiar because the research questions are very much the same. We're just doing a follow-up, trying to correct all of the problems and the mistakes that we made in the pilot study. So when we asked the children, and I'll tell you what the prompt is in a minute, when we asked the children to draw and to write and to talk about their drawing and their writing, we wanted to know what forms did the children actually use to represent meaning when we asked them to draw, and what forms did they use when we asked them to write, and were there actual differences? And in some cases there weren't. Because they're really young children, when we asked them to write, they drew as well. So the task was to differentiate drawing and writing, but just the way that the children responded to the task helped us to understand what their concepts were of drawing and writing. We also wanted to look at how the children in each grade level, so because we have kindergarten and grade 1, and something that's also interesting that anybody who works for the ministry might find interesting, is that we had children in Alberta who at the age of 5 were in kindergarten for the first time. We also had children in Ontario who at the age of 5 had been in kindergarten for 2 years. So we were in a position, because we had relatively similar numbers of children in each province, we were in a position to be able to look at what the children were able to do in the fall and the spring of each year, about 1 year, to see what the differences were in how they drew and wrote in response to the prompt. And then we were also interested in their language when they talked about their writing, or when they talked about their drawing, and when they read back their writing. We were interested in their language. So here are the participants. Most of the children were in what would be called year 2 in Ontario, so they were 5 to 6 years old. They started the year at some point in the year they turned 5, the year that they started. And then we also had some what we call junior kindergartners in Ontario. About a quarter of the students were junior kindergartners, and then we also had some grade 1s. Most of the grade 1 students were in Alberta. You'll see that we had a fairly even mix, a few more male students than female who participated, and we had a few children who were beyond the age 5 and 6. There were a few 3-year-olds. There's a program in Alberta called PUF, Program Unit Funding, for some reason. I don't know why it's called that. But children, they are identified by nurses at the health unit as needing additional support with language especially, and so they go into the kindergartens at the age of 3, and they spend 3 years in kindergarten. So that's why we had some 3-year-olds. And then in the fall, we would have had some 3-year-olds in junior kindergarten classes as well. There were 9 communities in total that participated in the project. And in one community, there were 3 classrooms, 2 different schools, but otherwise it was always the same school. Most northern communities have 1 school per community. The data collection took place in October. Some stretched into early November just because of logistics of getting to the school. And then again in the spring, we went back to the schools, and that would have been more like late April and into May. The children were asked to do these things: to write their name first, to draw a picture of what they like to do with their family or friends, and then to tell us about what was in their picture. And then we asked them to write about what was in their picture. And what we found from the pilot study is that just generally asking the children to write about the picture tended to be a little difficult, because often, especially when the children told us this whole long story about their picture, they could not possibly write all that they had told us. So we often said, well, you said, and then we would quote something that they had said. Can you write that? And so that was the task, the writing task. And then we asked the children to read back what they had written, if they were able to. We video recorded, so we had iPods that were set up on gorilla grippers. Have you seen the gorilla grippers? They're very flexible, tripod legs, so you can just set them down and move them wherever you need to. So they were right close. And then we also had notes. We tried as much as possible because sometimes when you're doing your research, you will find nothing is ever pristine, the circumstances for gathering your data. So sometimes we were lucky and we were in a separate room. There were always 3 of us, by the way. There were 2 research assistants who came with me to every school so that we didn't take too long gathering data. So sometimes we were in separate rooms, but often we were in the hall. So when there were classes moving through, there'd be a lot of noise and so on. So we often wrote notes as well. We didn't just count on the recordings. And sometimes the iPods failed us too, so we wanted to have some kind of backup. Just so that we could get a sense of what the children were doing to carry out the tasks. So the data analysis went on and on and on and on, because even though it was sort of deductive, because we did have a lot of categories from all the research that had been done, but we still wanted, because our task was a little different from many of the other tasks where there had been prompts that were very rigid. In some cases, children were writing captions to a picture, or well, in some cases too, they were even dictated. The children were writing what was dictated. That was for some of the spelling assessments. So ours was very open-ended. The children drew a picture and they wrote something related to their picture. So in many cases, we developed codes that were either a little bit different from those in other research studies, or that were quite different. We ended up looking at 24 different variables, and this was over many, many iterations of having groups of graduate students take a look at what the writing was showing us, what the drawings were showing us, and deciding, okay, this is what we're going to be looking at. And then we looked at frequencies after that. So I'll show you some of what we found, just to give you a sense of the categories, or the codes that we use, sorry, the codes. In many cases, especially at the fall with the young children, we couldn't, if the child had not told us what it was, we would not be able to identify what it was. So we had a code that was called unidentifiable, scribbles, marks, and shapes. We had a code that was called identifiable images. So that's an example there. And really those were the 2, where we could tell what the child was drawing, or we could not. And you'll see that at the beginning of the year for the younger children, almost half of the children had, had identifiable images. And by the spring, almost everybody drew identifiable images. So and the young children were the ones who were least likely to draw identifiable images. So there was a lot of developmental, drawing development, I guess you would call, that was demonstrated in that task of drawing something that you liked, about something that you like to do with your family and friends. With the writing task, these are the codes that we used. In some cases, the children drew marks or lines or shapes. And one thing that we found very interesting is sometimes the child had finished drawing and had told us what was in the drawing. In some cases, went on very elaborate stories about what was in the drawing. In some cases, they just identified what was there. And then we asked them to write, and they would continue drawing. They would keep adding to their picture. But in some cases, the children did differentiate between the drawing and the writing, and they wrote marks, lines, or shapes. In some cases, they did scribbles that looked like cursive, so it looked like they were trying to do cursive writing. And in some cases, the forms were starting to look like letters. And then we did have letters. The children were writing actual letters. And what we noticed is, in terms of the children's use of actual letters, you'll notice there's growth. Grade 1, almost all the children were using letters right from the beginning of the year. Kindergarten, in the 4-year-olds, about half the children were writing letters already. And, even, I'm just thinking here with the K2, so the 5-year-olds, even the 5-year-olds who did not have, so this would be all the children, Alberta and Ontario, even the 5-year-olds who did not have that first year of schooling, of kindergarten, they were writing letters. So there'd been some kind of instruction going on where the children knew how to write letters, and that was already in the fall. Oh yes, the non-conventional size. That ended up not being a code after all. We got rid of that. We were wondering if the children would have a relative size difference. You know, the capital letters would stand up above the lower letters and so on. And that just, even in grade 1, at the end of grade 1, there was really no differentiation, so we just got rid of that code. Now, in terms of the content, so we didn't just look at what the forms were, we also looked at what the children were showing us, how they were communicating meaning in the content. And so we identified that children were using objects, so anything that didn't look human or animal that you know, had some kind of life to it that could act on its own, we called objects. And then anything that looked, any image that looked like it was a person or an animal that could do something, we called characters. And then if there was anything that looked like they gave you a sense of where the story was taking place, we call that setting. You'll see here just a rich setting of going fishing. And we saw a real progression at the beginning of the year, especially with the younger children. The children were more likely to draw objects or characters, and by the end of the school year, no matter what the age group was, they were more likely to create some kind of a setting. In terms of the writing, the children showed left to right directionality. So that's something, if you're familiar with the Marie Clay assessment, one of the criteria is that children show that they know that you go left to right, top to bottom when you're writing in English. But all of the children did that right from the beginning of the year, and so why bother doing anything with it? We just said, okay, everybody can do that. So that was it. We didn't bother using it as an assessment criteria. And all of the children, and this is something that we found interesting. A lot of the kindergarten teachers who started the project said, you know, all we hope for in terms of writing goals for our children at the end of kindergarten is that they can write their names. And so then we said, well, what if we say that when children are scribbling or when they are writing marks that kind of look like letters or maybe don't even look like letters, but they intend that those marks mean something, that they are words or phrases or sentences, what if we call that writing? Then can your students write? And they said, well, yeah, of course, our students can write that. And from that, then the teachers, as part of the major part of the project, this is just a small branch, started developing play-based learning experiences where writing was incorporated. And so we don't know if that had an impact on what we saw in this assessment, but all of the children, whether they made marks or scribbles or whatever, if we asked them to write and they did something that wasn't just adding on to their picture, they told us what it meant. They had a sense that meant something, that it was communicating something. Anyway, so in letter-sound relationships, like the alphabetic principle, it makes sense. You would hope that children, by the time they move through to grade 1, that they have a stronger sense of the alphabetic system. Now, the emergent spelling stage and so on, I'm going to tell you more about later. I brought some of the information about the spelling stages from the schema that we use. Donald Bear and Marcia Invernizzi and I can't remember all the names, but I know it's Bear, Invernizzi, Johnson, and somebody. Actually, I have the book here. But anyway, Templeton. Oh, Shane Templeton. I should have remembered Shane. Yes. They have a schema that's very, very comprehensive. And so we use their schema when we were looking at the actual spelling stages that children showed. We didn't look at Gentry or any of the others. And so you'll see that the range of spelling stages that the children demonstrated in their writing was much smaller for young children, much larger for the older children, which kind of makes sense. Should I explain all these to you right now? I'll give you sort of a cursory explanation. So the emergent stage would be a recognition of being able to hear the sounds of, say, the first letter of the word. So if they're spelling dinosaur, they can write the D for dinosaur, and maybe they can write another letter, the N possibly, or the S, but they're not writing any of the other letters in between. So that would be considered the emergent spelling stage. And early and mid-letter name, it's where the children, especially if the letter has its, like A, it makes A sound, and so it says A. It's an easy sound to figure out. Whereas I don't know what word. Y is a really tough one because Y, it doesn't make the Y sound. It makes the Y sound. So children would have a hard time with Y in the mid-letter name stage, but they would not have such a hard time with the long A. But they're getting more of the middle sounds in their words. And then, so that's within words. They can actually spell out some words as well. And then syllables and affixes. For grade 1, that's pretty amazing if they can actually write words that are multisyllabic and maybe put endings on words, ing or ed or something like that. Then you're pretty excited if you're a grade 1 teacher. So you're doing that. So here's what we noticed in terms of context for the writing, that the children read back their messages as sentences, not just words or labels. There was a growth from fall to spring. One thing that was interesting, so the grade 1 showed the largest increase, but one thing that we found that was interesting is the younger children, when they did their writing, they did not worry so much if there were letter sound matches. They just wrote and wrote and wrote. And then they told us, they would read back, and likely whatever they read to us at that point would be different if they read it to us again a week later. But they had very extensive, long sentences when they were reading back their writing. And so there actually was a reversal to what you would expect, that the grade 1 children were reading back fewer words at the end of the year than they were, than the kindergarten children were, because they were trying to match the words that they said with the words that they wrote. And their ability to write a lot of words was not as great as the ability to make up a story and tell the words. So that was an interesting difference that we noticed between kindergarten and grade 1s in the spring. So we looked at the talk before the children started drawing, and by the way, we haven't analyzed very extensively the children's talk. It's we're just now hiring 4 MT students to do a lot of transcribing of 270 some videos. But we did notice that these are the kinds of things that the children did when they talked before drawing. Because we were interested in the way that their talk reflected their thinking. So they often stated what their message was going to be. So we told them, or we asked them to tell us a story or show us in their drawing something that they like to do with their family. They often said, we go fishing. I like to go fishing with my family. So they would say it and then start to draw. And then often the talk would say, oh, it's going to take a long time here. So they sort of warn us of what the situation is going to be for us. And sometimes when they were then asked to write the message, they would tell us that they're not going to be able to write the message. While they were actually drawing, and I think this was, this is just drawing. I'm just going to do the writing because there are very similar, lots of similarities between the talk before, during, and after the drawing as compared with that talk while writing. So you'll just see, vocalize what they need in terms of what's happening when they're drawing or writing. When they're writing, of course, they're sounding out letters or saying the letters, whereas in the drawing, they might be just telling themselves what needs to go next in the drawing, or pointing out what's in their drawing. But often, you know, that feeling of, I'm done, that was a very common thing to say after the drawing and the writing. So when we looked at the drawing, again, we used some of the categories that other researchers had used. We found that when children wanted to create messages in their drawings, often they did that through size differences. There was, I can't remember a situation, and maybe Andrea, you looked at all those drawings too, yeah, where the adults looked the same size as the children in the drawings. I don't think there was ever a case. Yeah. So that's right, you could differentiate characters through size. And though it didn't happen as much at the beginning of the year, you'll see the differences here between fall and spring for each of the age groups. The children positioned the objects and the characters in ways that helped you to understand what the relationships were between them. So the children were telling us a lot. There were a lot of stories that if you looked at carefully at the drawings, you would have a chance to read the drawings and get the stories from the drawings. And in some cases, this is something I'm not very good at, they could show depth by showing some overlapping of
Those kids are sitting on a couch. I remember that.
Yes, that's
and they're
right.
watching TV. They're watching a video game, and they're playing a video game with the shark, where they have to shoot the shark. It's a video game. I know because I remember that drawing.
Thank you, Andrea. See, if you spend some time, you really get to know the picture, what the story is in the picture. So you have some really sophisticated, complicated drawings, text drawings. So when we asked the children to talk about their drawings, in many cases, the children told us what it was. They would give a label for an object, or they would tell us what it was doing, going fishing or something like that. Often, the stories that they told about their drawings were using simple sentences, and there's an example there. Sometimes there were some kinds of qualifiers. So in this case, the cat is walking out, and where's the cat going? So it's an adverbial phrase here, to his house. So sometimes there were more complex sentences, but for the most part, children use labels or simple sentences. And here, look, so we're going to the dance, Charlie goes to the ballet, but I don't, so my mom's trying to sign me up for something else. So there's a lot of explanation there, too, a lot of intention and motivation behind the stories that are told about the drawings. And, oh yes, and so here is an example of the grade 1's drawings. And here you've got a whole long story. Oh, and this is the one that Andrea was talking about, yes.
And you can see in his hand like a remote. There's a little remote he describes. I remember the description in the actual
that's right.
talking. It's like he had a little remote in his hand. That's just using it.
So lots of detail. And when you think about it, so the children are sitting at probably a desk or a table, maybe out in the hallway with a whole bunch of other kids coming by all the time. They're able to put that kind of concentration and effort into these drawings for somebody. They knew us. It's not that we were strangers, but we were generally in the schools about 5 times a year. So we weren't, like the furniture or anything like that. They didn't see us every day. So, we were just in awe of what the children were able to do in that very limited kind of circumstance. And then with the writing, I had talked earlier about the various types of forms. And so here's what the children said about those letters. So this is trampoline. This is a monster go away. And then you've got Rachel here. Oops, here. This is the writing for Rachel. And look here, a very, very long story to that scribble. So the children were very clearly aware that they could communicate with symbols, that they did not have to have actual letters like the adults in their lives did. They could say a lot with scribbles and lines. And then here you've got a lot of letters. This would be kind of an emergent moving into the next stage. And look here too, setting up. So we've got the characters all set up, and then a description of what happened in the hot tub. So that's all I'm going to tell you about for this study. I can tell you some things that have happened since then. So Andrea has been involved in creating a set of exemplars. We had promised the teachers that after we gathered all of these 270 samples, we would find the modal characteristics, so the characteristics that were most common among the 4-year-olds when they, in the fall, and the 4-year-olds in the spring. And we would not only provide the examples, but we would also describe them. And so then anybody can go onto our website. It seems like this cut off a lot earlier than I was expecting it to. I wonder what happened to the rest of the slides. Maybe I'll just have to tell you a few of the other things. Anyway, so I will pass this around. This is Andrea's handiwork.
Oh, I think I had help too.
Well, yeah. But Andrea was involved to a great extent in this with Miriam, another doctoral student, and myself as well. So that's one of the outcomes of this project, because we had all of these samples of writing. We had 4-year-old children and also 5- and 5- and 6-year-old children so we could talk about development. We had the samples at the beginning of the year, the end of the year, so we could show progress. My other slides. Well, anyway, I'll tell you about this. So this is something that's on our website, and I'll actually go to the website now. I have no idea what happened to those slides. They just disappeared. It's the Now Play website. And if you go to classroom resources, here are the exemplars. So I'll just show them here because you're not going to be able to. And so one thing, so the 4-year-olds here, this is what most 4-year-olds could do in the fall when they were writing their name. Oh, and I didn't talk about the name writing, but all the children could write their name. So again, it wasn't something that we really wanted to highlight because everybody could do it. So we mostly looked at the criteria where the children showed some differentiation across the ages. So there's a circle for the head, was most common for the 4-year-olds. And then you've got sticks coming up to the head. And there is some size differentiation. And in this case, Isabella, when she was asked to write, she drew a rectangle around her drawing. So that was for writing it. And she wasn't, I think we would have said if she was able to say something about it, right? And I'm just going to skip down to 5-year-olds in the first year of kindergarten. So, oh yeah, and actually the drawing, what happened to the drawing? Oh, here it is here. So the drawing of the 5-year-olds, whether they were in Alberta or in Ontario, the drawings were not that different. It was the writing that was quite different. So here, Katie is in her first year of kindergarten. She writes her name very clearly. She's doing a lot of drawing, and she can tell us what's happening, painting, but she's not doing any writing. Whereas 5-year-olds in the second year of kindergarten, oh, I see here. So this is, and remember, these are the modal characteristics. So these are the characteristics that showed up most frequently. So 5-year-olds in Ontario in the fall were mostly able to write some letters. So they were at the emergent stage. They were writing letters that represented some of the sounds and words, and but unable to read it back. So there was a difference in the fall between the two groups. So let me show you the spring. So here's George Spring, first year of kindergarten. So in spring, George is writing pretty similarly to the second year child in the fall. And this is first year kindergarten. And then same thing here. Oh, I think there's no tobogganing, okay? So no tobogganing, I think is what they're doing. So again, same thing. They've got a lot of the letters there. And oh, and I was sleeping with my mom, so all the letters are there. And then here we've got, so this is a 5-year-old in the second year of kindergarten, and we have a lot of letters again. There's not, oh, we have there's second year of kindergarten. Okay, there's first year. So yeah, I guess. So it's first and second year, they're not that different. So we're figuring that it's developmental as much as it is environmental.
They can't see the people out.
Oh, that's right.
Because you should lose. If you finished your PowerPoint, you should get out of your PowerPoint and.
Oh, so they can see my screen.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Oh yeah. Well, meanwhile, you can follow on the website.
Now-play.org.
Now-play.org. That is indicated in the last acknowledgement slide. So if you just open that and you go to resources, what was it? Resources.
Yes, teachers' resources.
Teachers' resources. And then it's a word to find or a PDF to find, and you scroll down.
Anyway, it gives you, you can go and find it for yourself as well. But so we thought it was interesting that there, in terms of the writing development, it seems like the age of the child has a lot to do with what happens at the end of kindergarten, okay, what would we call senior kindergarten, as opposed to actually have to be in kindergarten for 2 years. So now I need to get out of here.
Yeah, if you end your show, and maybe you can find your.
And then go back to the website.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, I know you.
Think that will work?
I'm not sure because we keep seeing that one. See,
I think she has to stop share and then share the other one to be able to.
Oh, that makes sense.
Otherwise, or you could share your entire
Yes,
desktop
that
and then it
makes
shares
sense.
everything.
right, and share. Yeah, share
Yeah.
that.
Now they should see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see
Okay,
that
sorry
now?
about that. I should have thought that.
Yes,
That's what
that's great. Thank you.
So that's one outcome. And I don't know what happened to these slides, why they just disappeared. I have 3 other slides for you to look at. Anyway, one thing that we have found in our assessment, like other assessments that are always trying to show that there is actually progress, that we are measuring something that will differentiate between those who are younger and older, or at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year. Our assessment did do that. One thing we found as well, that the children who were in 2 years of kindergarten at the end of their 2nd year, the range was a lot larger. So it seemed like the children who were doing well as 5-year-olds in senior kindergarten were able to grow a lot to a greater extent. So there were still some children who were maybe at the emergent stage at the end of senior kindergarten. But there were some students who were already moving into syllables and affixes, which is very complex. We didn't see as much of a range in the Alberta kindergarten children who only had 1 year of kindergarten. So that's I think probably the biggest I don't know, discovery about the difference between the two, having senior kindergarten or having and junior kindergarten, or just having the one, that those who are going to do well are nurtured so that they can do a lot better. But development has a lot to do with how the children are going to do in terms of their writing. And actually, I can just tell you as an anecdote, so Mari Clay was here in Toronto back in the, I don't know, early 2000s when the observation survey was released in French. She and I co-taught a class, a graduate class, and somebody asked her once, so does it really make a difference if children are taught to write at the age of 4, or the age of 5, or the age of 6, or even 7, because in some Scandinavian countries, children are encountering formal schooling at the age of 7. And Mari's answers was, no, it doesn't make any difference, because development is going to allow those children to catch up. So those 7-year-olds who have, for the first time, encountered some kind of formal literacy instruction are going to be doing as well as the 7-year-olds who had many years of literacy instruction by the end of the year. So, and that's really what Mari just told us off the cuff, based on her marvelous wisdom and research, is what we found in our study too. As far as implications for research, so one thing that we would like to do in future is consider the writing that's gathered as part of regular classroom activity. We have done a lot of studies because we have probably thousands of videos of children engaged in play, and often the play involves writing. We have never really looked at ways to assess it using this very complex kind of structure. We have an informal assessment that we've given to teachers and are hoping, well, the article is being submitted. I think Nicholas is submitting it today. But it's very much more simplified, and we're looking to see, does classroom writing that's involved with play or just writer's workshop in kindergarten grade 1, can that be assessed using these criteria as well? And should we be assessing the drawing in as complex a way as we have with this more formal assessment? And then we're also looking at the verbalization. So as I said earlier, we're getting all of the transcripts, we're getting all of the videos transcribed so that we can look at what the children are saying and how it's having an impact on their drawing and their writing. while they're drawing and while they're writing. And so that actually was the last slide. And so I don't know what happened to the slides, but I apologize for losing them. What I thought you might find interesting is having a look at some of our data and using our scoring criteria to analyze some of the data. I wasn't sure, I should have asked, but I guess you would not have known how many people were going to be here exactly anyway.